Ho ho ho, ladies and gents. This is George Bean, and it's Christmas time, so I figured I'd finally do it. I am reviewing the 1988 Christmas action thriller film Die Hard, which was directed by John McTiernan, written by Stephen E. D'Souza and Jet Stewart, and produced by Joel Silver, and stars Bruce Willis as John McClane and the late but great Alan Rickman as Hans Gruber. Upon its release on July the 18th of 1988, and with a $28 million budget, the film had grossed over $140 million at the worldwide box office. But in terms of critical receptions, the film had initially received mixed reviews from critics, especially from the late critic Roger Ebert, who gave it a 2.5 stars out of 4. But in later years, the film had garnered much larger critical acclaim. The film had practically turned Bruce Willis into an action star and became a metonym for an action film in which a lone hero fights overwhelming odds. And finally, just last year in 2017, the film was selected for preservation in the U.S. National Film Registry. The plot. It's Christmas Eve, and so off-duty NYPD officer John McClane decides to spend it reconciling with his estranged wife Holly at the Nakatomi Plaza, the building owned by the corporation she works for, during a Christmas party there. However, while waiting for the party to die down, a group of German terrorists, led by Hans Gruber, arrive and take over the Plaza Tower, holding everyone inside hostage. But luckily, McClane manages to evade the takeover, and as the night progresses, he does anything he can to take down the terrorists and save his wife and everyone else within the skyscraper. Now, what I am about to explain to you will sound a bit comprehensive, but I will do my best in explaining to you as thoroughly as possible, even if you had already heard about it. But this film was actually based on a standalone novel in 1979 by Roderick Thorpe, titled Nothing Lasts Forever, which was a sequel to his 1966 novel, The Detective. The latter novel, The Detective, had been adapted into a film in 1969 starring Frank Sinatra as Detective Joe Leyland. Years later, Roderick Thorpe claimed that the inspiration for Nothing Lasts Forever came from a dream he had after viewing the 1974 disaster film The Towering Inferno, in which he dreamed he was in a skyscraper being chased by men with guns, and so he went about writing Nothing Lasts Forever based on this dream. And I do have to say one thing, that Nothing Lasts Forever title actually kind of sounds like it could fit perfectly as the title for a James Bond film, but I digress. But one interesting thing that I had read about over this film's title had came from this film's producer Joel Silver when he was doing an interview for Shane Black's 2016 crime comedy film The Nice Guys. According to Silver, the Die Hard title was actually the initial title for Shane Black's original script for The Last Boy Scout, and Silver had called up Shane and asked him if he could use that title for this film, which thankfully is now called Die Hard. So of course, when Fox got the film rights to Nothing Lasts Forever, they had to ask Sinatra first if he wanted to reprise his Joe Leyland role for it. But thankfully, Sinatra opted to turn it down, citing his age being a factor. He was in his early 70s by that point. And so now with Sinatra out of the picture, Fox had went forward with the adaptation still. Now to also mention as well, but there has been a years-long debate that this film had also almost come close to being a sequel to the 1985 action film Commando, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, which was also distributed by 20th Century Fox. According to the murmurs I've heard, the Nothing Lasts Forever book was retooled to become Commando 2, with Arnold slated to return in his role as John Matrix. But Arnold didn't want to do a sequel, and apparently Fox had decided to retool it to make it a standalone film, changing the hero from John Matrix to John McClane, but Arnold had still turned it down, and so Fox had still chosen to go with making the film as a standalone. Now, this is just a debate, because lately writer Stephen E. DeSouza had came out and made it clear that the Commando 2 thing was not true. But to say, it is an interesting to mention this murmur when talking about the development behind Die Hard, and an interesting what could have been for this film. It's actually kind of funny because each Die Hard film had initially started off as entirely different spectrums before being retooled into a Die Hard film. For Die Hard 2, it was based on a standalone book called 58 Minutes, taking mostly the basic bare-bones premise of terrorists seizing control of an airport during a snowy winter. For Die Hard with a Vengeance, that was originally a script titled Simon Says, which had almost been turned into a Brandon Lee vehicle, and then almost into Lethal Weapon 4. And finally, for Live Free or Die Hard, it started off as a standalone script titled WWE.com, which itself was inspired by a Wired magazine article called A Farewell to Arms, which hypothesized a possible major cyber-terrorist attack on the United States. The only exception was the fifth film, A Good Day to Die Hard. That film was not inspired by any other particular thing, and was written by Skip Woods, the same guy who wrote the Hitman movies and X-Men Origins Wolverine. And as a side note, the movie, while faithful to the book, is also vastly different from it. One example being the tone to it. Like in the book, it has, to say the least, a violent and somewhat depressing tone to it. So much so that when the villain falls out of the window to his death, he grabs the hero's daughter and takes her with him to their deaths, leaving the hero emotionally broken. And as for the cast, Bruce Willis was absolutely stellar as NYPD police officer John McClane in this film, this being his first lead role in an action film. One huge thing I love about McClane is that, even though he is an action hero, he is not as superpowered as someone like Arnold Schwarzenegger or Sylvester Stallone. McClane is more of a regular NYPD cop. He even has a beer belly, and so when he is wounded, he is actually very wounded and even shows it. He bleeds. Unlike how in Commando, even if he gets injured, Arnold would just walk it off and still shoot the bad guys with successful aim. But here, not so much. McClane knows he is no Arnold Schwarzenegger. Even if he did try to shoot at all the bad guys in the one room, he would be dead before he'd ever kill the last three. He knew he was dealing with overwhelming odds. So he'd have to be sneaky and try to take them out one by one, even if it took him all night. And by the end of the film, he looked so badly battered and injured that it had almost looked like he was just 5 seconds away from passing out from exhaustion and severe blood loss. That's the kind of action hero I prefer. One that actually bleeds when injured. It shows that they are still human beings that can take a beating. But there's this great video from Screen Junkies called Honest Action Die Hard, in which they have an actual doctor analyze McClane's injuries into account. And in the video, McClane actually dies a few times, and they say that McClane would require 4 lives to complete Die Hard. And they didn't just do the first movie, but also the sequels. Like in Die Hard 2, he surprisingly survives the whole movie without losing any lives. But in Die Hard 3, he immediately dies straight away just from the drama from getting hit in the head by that bottle. 10 minutes in, bottle whacked overhead, epidural hematoma. John McClane is dead. He couldn't even survive the fucking subway crash. You can find links to these videos in the description box below this video. Seriously, go check them out. They're fucking hilarious. What is crazy is how Willis was actually the very last person considered for the role. Before Willis, almost everybody else was approached for the role, all of whom turned it down. From Arnold Schwarzenegger, to Sylvester Stallone, to Mel Gibson, to even Richard Gere of all people, believe it or not. But for some reason or another, all of those actors had turned the role down, and so the studio had ultimately, and somewhat reluctantly, gone for Bruce Willis, who was mostly known at the time as a little-known comedy actor, having starred in the 1980s detective sitcom series Moonlighting, as well as starring opposite Kim Basinger in the 1987 romantic comedy film Blind Date, which was directed by Blake Edwards of the Pink Panther fame. So, casting Bruce Willis was a huge gamble for the studio and film, but as history shows, this had paid off big time for the studio, the film itself, and Willis himself, as this film had made him a superstar for years to come afterwards. Interestingly, Bruce almost turned this film down too, due to his contractual commitments to Moonlighting. But after his co-star Sybil Shepherd became pregnant, Moonlighting was shut down for 11 weeks, which gave Bruce sufficient time to work on Die Hard. And he was paid $5 million to star in the role, a figure which was virtually unheard of at the time for an actor who had starred in only one moderately successful film, and normally only paid to someone like Dustin Hoffman and Warren Beatty. Alan Rickman was stellar as German terrorist Hans Gruber, does a fantastic job playing him as this calm and calculating extremist, who has meticulously plotted almost every step of the entire Nakatomi heist. What makes Hans so memorable is that he's shown to be a cold and calculating man who has planned out every step of the heist plan, even taking in mind the possibility of the FBI showing up. I remember first seeing Rickman in the Harry Potter movies starting at age 8, where he played Professor Severus Snape. And so when I recognized him as Hans in this film, I was absolutely stunned and amazed. I love his voice. She could surely survive another minute without you. He's brilliant, but was a sad loss when he died from cancer back in 2016. It was tragic to hear. But it's just hilarious. But now every time I see a British actor playing a villain, I'll keep thinking of that Jaguar 2014 Super Bowl commercial starring Ben Kingsley, Mark Strong, and Tom Hiddleston, where they point out how in Hollywood movies, the villains are always played by Brits. Maybe we just sound right. We're more focused, more precise. We're always one step ahead, with a certain style, an eye for detail, and we're obsessed with power. A stiff upper lip is key, and we all drive Jaguars. Oh yes, it's good to be bad. Damn true. As for Alexander Goodenough, he was absolutely stellar as Carl, Han's second in command in the terrorist group. He plays Carl as a cold-hearted killer who desires to kill McClane to avenge his brother's death, but regularly ends up left pissed off whenever McClane manages to escape his grasp throughout the film. Goodenough pitch perfectly showed off just how pissy Carl was at McClane. The pissiness and frustration at missing him was done brilliantly. Even in one scene after he once again unsuccessfully kills McClane, who escaped by walking on the broken glass barefoot, Carl returns to the 30th floor, where the hostages are held at, and then, just when John's wife Holly is looking at him, Carl suddenly smashes up a champagne bucket in frustration. That's when Holly immediately figures out that her husband John is still alive, reasoning only John can drive somebody that crazy. It's such a great line. It truly shows how much John really is a monkey in the wrench, as he had earlier described himself on the radio to Hans. There's also William Atherton as TV reporter Richard Thornburg. One thing I've noticed is that he always seems to play characters with names that somehow refer to the Dick. In this film, his name is Richard Thornburg, or Dick, and in Ghostbusters, his name is Walter Peck, as in Pecker. And another thing, I mentioned Atherton because he was also in the 1990 made-for-TV revenge film Buried Alive, which starred Tim Matheson and Jennifer Jason Leigh, which was actually a pretty decently good film when I used to watch it on tape. I mentioned Buried Alive because it was, shockingly enough, directed by Frank Darabont, before he would go on to direct The Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile. So I'd recommend checking out Buried Alive. That is, if you're lucky enough to find it. Maybe try Amazon. Now, to also mention as well, one of the minor terrorists was played by an actor named Wilhelm von Homburg, who you may better know as Vigo the Carpathian in Ghostbusters 2. So yeah, that's a nice little Easter egg there. The music was composed by the late actor Michael Kamen, whose other credits include the Lethal Weapon series, the 1996 live-action remake of 101 Dalmatians, and even the underrated 1997 sci-fi horror film Event Horizon. Kamen's score in this film is very memorable, very catchy to hum to, especially during the climax on the Nakatomi rooftop. I do love that one piece at the end with the dun, 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 dun. You know what I mean. I don't know why, but I just love humming to that piece. But I will say, after having finally watched Lethal Weapon a couple years prior, there were moments in that film score that sounded suspiciously like the score in Die Hard. But then again, it was during a time when movies would copy and paste pieces of a music score from other films, like in Aliens. So this film, Die Hard, used the same piece of music that was used at the ending of Aliens. So one thing to mention about Michael Kamen is that he had also unfortunately passed away in 2003 at age 55 from a heart attack as a possible result from multiple sclerosis. But he has left behind a legacy of very memorable film scores, especially in the action genre. To admit, I had actually seen Die Hard 2 first before seeing this one, so the second one, with the bigger explosions, had resorted more to me as a kid, and this film had less explosions in it, at least to me. But as I grew older, I began to grow more into the first film, and along with that, my favorite sequel had changed from Die Hard 2 to Die Hard with a Vengeance more. And I had actually seen Live Free or Die Hard in the cinema when I was 14, and I had actually enjoyed it. I did like how it updates the series to the post 9/11 world, and how cyber-terrorism could be the new threat. But then they made the fifth film, A Good Day to Die Hard, in 2013, of which I will happily agree with everybody that it was horrendous and how it looked and felt nothing like an actual Die Hard film. The action scenes were dull and lazily tried to copy the shaky cam work from the Jason Bourne films. And Bruce Willis looked bored in that film. I mean, seriously, Bruce Willis looked bored throughout that film. Like as if he had just been taking just wanted to sleep through most of the movie. But honestly, as a dumbass action film on its own, it's decent. Shitty, but decent. And then, of course, Bruce had also announced Die Hard 6, which, according to news reports, is said to be a prequel focusing on John McClane as a younger New York cop in the 1970s. Now, while I do wish that they just quit making more Die Hard films in the series, I am somewhat minorly intrigued by the idea of a Die Hard prequel. One based on what I heard, based on the Year One comics, which had McClane as a young cop in the 70s, and it apparently also featured him having to experience the 1977 New York blackout and the Son of Sam serial killer. That I would honestly be intrigued to see in such a Die Hard prequel. But I will for now just wait and see if this Die Hard 6 ever does actually see the light of day anytime soon. But either way, having already seen Die Hard 2, it wasn't until a year later, when I was 15 at least, when I finally got to watch the first film on a VHS I had borrowed from my uncle. At least 13 years old. And of course I first did not think much of it. I believe it was mainly because it was set in this one building, so no car chases or anything of the likes. But now in the past 11 years, I have grown more towards the original film because of how well crafted it was in its story, characters, and action scenes. One thing I should compliment for is John McTiernan's astounding direction on this film. Riding off the success of his previous film, Predator, McTiernan makes every shot in this film feel working and balanced. He knows how to perfectly frame his shots. He keeps the camera sitting still when shooting an action scene, allowing us to watch the scene at ease without the use of shaky cam or quick cuts. And I should also compliment him for being able to ground the story and characters in a realistic way, while also managing to keep the film feeling fun and exciting. It was his idea to tone down the book's violence for the film. He also did not want the villains to be the terrorists, considering them too mean, and so he instead chose to avoid the terrorists' politics in favor of making them thieves in pursuit of monetary gain, believing it would make the film more suitable for summer entertainment. And also, apparently, in the original script, the film's events took place over the course of 3 days, but McTiernan instead chosen to set it entirely on one single night, having been inspired by Shakespeare's A Midnight Summer's Dream. As a side note, to be honest, I would love to read the script that had this film taking place over 3 days, just to see how different the films would have been depicted in such a time frame. But still, I consider McTiernan to be one of the most criminally underrated action film directors out there, with such 2 great films. It really is honestly a sad shame that around the 2000s, his career was thrown away when he was arrested for a scandal in which he had tapped the phones of producer Charles Roven, with whom he worked with on the 2002 remake of Rollerball. Even though McTiernan is out of jail now, it is very likely that he will never be able to direct another film ever again anytime soon. But now, back to Die Hard. One thing I love about this film is how it keeps trying to compare itself to a Western film, especially how Hans keeps referring to McClane as a cowboy, and McClane's signature catchphrase is "Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker." But yeah, when you think about it more, this movie is more or less a Cowboys and Indians movie, in that movie that just so happens to be set in a Los Angeles skyscraper. But as a funny fact, the Nakatomi Tower in which the film is set entirely at was actually the Fox Plaza, which was owned by 20th Century Fox. which you can see on as the logo on the DVD cover. Yep, they own this tower. So essentially, Fox had financed a film that takes place in their very own Plaza Tower. But then again, this is Fox. These guys love to show themselves off in their own movies. Self-promotions. And one thing to bring up involves how the LA police is depicted in this film, especially the Deputy Chief Dwayne T. Robinson. The thing is that they're meant to be depicted as being somewhat cartoonish and inept. Like, they're meant to be seen as being a bit dickish and even a bit stupid and mostly incompetent. In terms of trying to handle the hostage situation in Nakatomi Tower, the police make themselves appear to be hotshot and cool, but they end up failing miserably when they are attacked by the terrorists. Like, when they try to cut through the front doorway, they get shot at, and then the police end up sending their RV to drive up to the front door, only for the terrorists to then fire upon it with a rocket launcher. Also, I had never noticed it when I first saw this film as a little kid, but it turns out that the villains in this film are not actually terrorists, as I pointed out earlier. Even Hans laughs at the thought of them being terrorists. They are more like thieves coming to heist the tower. They're really there to steal the $640 million in bearer bonds locked away in the vault in the tower. So in a way, this movie is sort of like a heist movie, if you look at it that way from the villain's perspective. And really, according to Stephen E. D'Souza, he had wrote this film's script from the perspective of Hans Gruber. He claimed to have written it when viewing Hans as a protagonist, which is an odd way of writing a script like that, but it does actually help to write a script in an unusual way. When discussing writing the script as if Hans were the protagonist, D'Souza stated, if he had not planned the robbery and put it together, Bruce Willis would have just gone to the party and reconciled or not with his wife. You should sometimes think about looking at your movie through the point of view of the villain, who is really driving the narrative. One interesting fact is that in the scene where Hans and John meet face to face for the first time, and Hans disguises himself with an American accent, I've heard that scene was added into the film after the filmmakers found out that Alan Rickman could do an American accent. But if that is true, then that meant that without this scene, then John and Hans would not have met face to face until the final climax. Now, to be honest, I am glad this scene was added in, because I'm always a fan of when the hero and villain meet face to face. It's so that they can meet each other and speak to each other, so they can learn more about each other, what makes each other tick, and what length they will go to stop each other, etc. So yeah, I'm glad that this scene was added into the film, because by that point, they both know what the other looks like at that point. And with Hans disguising himself, it's the one scene where he and John can interact without trying to kill each other. But finally, it's that big moments in the climax where all the hostages are placed on the rooftop of the tower, where everything is going to come to a head. The FBI are coming in helicopters to shoot the terrorists dead, and the terrorists are planning to detonate the C4 to blow up the roof, to provide a distraction for them to escape. As a quick mention, I do also love that moment, one quick moment when the FBI agents, Johnson and Johnson, are on the helicopter and they mention Vietnam. The old Johnson says, just like fucking Saigon, hey slick? And young Johnson responds with, I was in junior high, dickhead. That's funny. It shows the age difference between them. Thought I should mention that. But anyway, John, or at least what's left of him, manages to drive the hostages off the roof back down the stairs, and he ends up almost getting shot at by the choppers. years. Knowing the roof is about to be blown to hell, John does an insane stunt by jumping off the roof while harnessed to a fire hose. It's that awesome moment when McClane jumps just as the rooftop is blown into Kingdom Come. The explosion becomes so big that the roof and even the choppers become consumed by a massive growing fireball. The explosion becomes so big that the movie even cuts to a faraway shot showing the LA skyline, and you can see how big this fireball is on top of the tower. Such a cool ass shot there. It is the very best scene in the whole movie. After almost 2 hours of cat and mouse action with shootouts and claustrophobic moments, the big rooftop explosion kind of feels very cathartic, like the big fireworks moments. What an awesome moment for a climax in an action movie. It's even on the posters and DVD cover. But yes, after having watched this movie for years, and even analyzing what makes it so good, it is really no wonder it has left behind a strong legacy and has spawned rip-off copycats in the ensuing 10 years following this film's release. After this film, there have been a long series of films that have tried to copy this film's formula, and has spawned the term Die Hard on a blank. Like, for example, Under Siege is Die Hard on a battleship, Speed is Die Hard on a bus, Cliffhanger is Die Hard on a mountain, The Rocket is Die Hard on an island, Air Force One is Die Hard on an airplane, the 2013 films Olympus Has Fallen and White House Down are both Die Hard in the White House. And finally, even the 2010 Kevin James comedy Paul Blart Mall Cop is essentially Die Hard in a shopping mall. And so much so that I have even heard of several unproduced scripts with the formula. One titled Gale Force was Die Hard in a Hurricane. Another titled High Roller was Die Hard in a Casino. And even a couple of years ago, I had read a movie report about Paramount Pictures purchasing a script that was pitched as Die Hard on an alien spaceship. So yeah, you see it shows just how influential this one action film from 1988 has truly become in the past 30 years since its original release. There's no denying it here. And of course, as a kid growing up, since watching this film, I had grown into watching movies with that premise. Movies like Cliffhanger, Under Siege, The Rock, and many others. And even as someone who does screenwriting as a hobby, I had even written some of my own scripts with that formula, even a Die Hard on an oil rig script. So yeah, I can safely say that Die Hard may be one of my favorite action films along the likes of Lethal Weapon, Terminator, True Lies, and several others. And another interesting thing that has been brought up is whether or not this movie counts as a Christmas movie, given that it is set primarily on one night on Christmas Eve, and thus has Christmas decorations, Christmas trees, and even Christmas songs featured in this film. Now, I have known many people who say that they tend to watch this film on Christmas time as a tradition. In 2010, Empire magazine had voted this film as the greatest Christmas film of all time. Just last year, the film Stephen E. D'Souza had stated on Twitter that it is a Christmas film. However, just recently at his Comedy Central roast, Bruce Willis himself had declared that quote, Die Hard is not a Christmas movie. It is a goddamn Bruce Willis movie. End quote. Now, for what I believe, I will say, I'm willing to respect anyone's own opinions, and thus I will respect both Stephen E. D'Souza and Bruce Willis' differing opinions. But for me, I myself actually consider it to be a Christmas movie, on the grounds that, as I said, it is set on Christmas Eve, its setting includes a Christmas party, and even features Christmas songs, including Let It Snow. It is nice to watch a movie on Christmas time as a break from watching the more usual Christmas films like A Christmas Story, Christmas Vacation, It's a Wonderful Life, and many others. But it also seems that even 20th Century Fox believes that it is a Christmas movie, because just this month, in an attempt to acknowledge the debate over this, they had released a special Die Hard Christmas edition on home video for the film's 30th anniversary, and had even included a recut trailer presenting the film as a heartwarming Christmas story. If you yourself should ever want to check out this recut trailer, you can find a link to it in the description box below this video. Check it out if you want to. So overall, I'm willing to give Die Hard an earned rating of 9 stars out of 10, because it is a very effective action film that is set entirely in this one skyscraper building about a lone cop finding himself pitted against overwhelming odds when he has to battle 13 terrorists. Bruce Willis and Alan Rickman gives very stellar performances, which would effectively jumpstart their careers into stardom, with Bruce becoming an action hero and Rickman going on to play Professor Snape in the Harry Potter series. And even so, it can also be seen as a film to watch on Christmas time as a tradition, but it is a massively entertaining action thriller with an effective use of its claustrophobic setting and an effective hero with enough vulnerability for audiences to root for. If you haven't watched it yet, I'd highly recommend Die Hard. You will not be disappointed, and maybe even check out its sequels as well if you want to kill some time. So thank you for watching, ladies and gents, and I would wish you all a very Merry Christmas this year, you filthy animals, and an overwhelmingly Happy New Year for 2019. And until then, I will see you all next time. Peace!